Hello everybody, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us to our next Land at Lunch webinar on the emerging impacts of land use change for net zero. So we're here 12 till 12:45 today, and we'll finish promptly on time. So we've got a few different things in the session today. There'll be time for Q&A, and we're really keen to hear from people today, either in the chat or in the Q&A box. And Lisa will explain a bit more about that in just a moment. So we've got Lisa Busby with us, who is our training coordinator. And we also have James McKessick-Leach, who is a policy and practice lead. Okay, Lisa, I'll hand over to you for the housekeeping. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. I'll kick off with just a few pieces of information and housekeeping before we start. So today's webinar is being recorded, including the chat and the Q&A. And information on how the recording is going to be used and our full privacy policy, I'm about to post into the chat now. So everyone's camera and mic are off by default, but we welcome your questions in the question and answer box and comments in the chat box. So questions in the Q&A box are asked anonymously, if you prefer. And your screen name is always visible in the chat. But if you did want to make a comment in the Q&A box that's anonymous, that's possible. So that can be used for both things. In today's session, we also have the option for you to turn on closed captions. So the function is enabled by using the CC button on the control panel at the bottom of your screen. We would just flag that these captions are auto-generated, so there may be some inaccuracies out of our control. We're going to be collating some feedback throughout the session in the form of some short Zoom polls, and we're really grateful for your input into these. The polls are anonymous and we won't share the answers to the entire group. In just a moment, I'll post some more info about how that data is used, and that'll pop up in the chat too. Lastly, I just want to flag we're going to be signposting some resources today, and I'll be posting links in the chat as we go along. So you can access any that are particularly relevant or pertinent to you right away. But we also collate all the tools, all the links, and a video of this webinar on a single resources page, and I'll post the link to that resources page at the end of the webinar. So make sure you hang on till the end to get that link. So if you've got any questions about any aspect of the housekeeping, just go ahead and pop them into the chat. But right now, we're just going to get you involved in a super quick poll. So poll number 1, let's get that launched and let you start to take part. So hopefully you can see that. There's 4 questions. So do scroll through to make sure that you can answer all 4. And someone just give me a shout if you can't access that for any reason. I can see some people are participating, so. Okay, I'll give you a few moments to fill that out, and I'll pop the privacy policy pertaining to that in the chat now. Thank you. Once again, like you giving us the feedback in these helps us design future sessions and make them better for everyone that attends. So we're really grateful. And I'm going to disappear now, and I'm going to hand over to James for the first part of our session. James, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. So before we get stuck into things, just a wee bit myself. I'm James McKessick-Leach, Policy and Practice Lead at the Land Commission. Amongst the various things that I work on or have been working on for the Commission is what's going on in the land market, and particularly around natural capital. But before we get stuck into that, just a wee bit on the Land Commission itself, particularly for those of you who are new to our work or joining us for the first time in one of these sessions. So the Land Commission is a small non-departmental public body. So we are public servants funded by government, based in Inverness, although with people all around the country. We are kind of overseen by commissioners. So there's 5 land commissioners and the tenant farming commissioner, who has a particular role in agricultural holdings. And the work of the Commission revolves around a number of different areas, but broadly, there's an element of kind of research and policy development and making recommendations to ministers, as well as partners and stakeholders. And also there's a large chunk of our work is focused on good practice. So these sessions are very much part of that, but also an extensive range of guidance and protocols and various other things that the team there lead. So today, I'm going to take you through some of the work that we've done over the last year or so, investigating the natural capital impact in the land market, or what we've seen happening, particularly in the last couple of years, so calendar years 2020 and 2021. I don't have control of the slides, so I will be asking Emma to go to the next slide, please, throughout this, but there's not too many of them, so we'll get through those fairly rapidly. So next slide, there we go. So essentially, we published a couple of pieces of work earlier this year looking at the land market. So there are two reports that we published. So one was an insights report, which essentially collates the information from a range of interviews with land agents in particular, but other people involved in transactions in the land market. And a second report looking more at the data. So this was largely provided through Registers of Scotland transaction data, and both of those reports are available through our website in the natural capital section there. But broadly, the findings were as you can see on the screen, there are different drivers across the different types of land and regions within Scotland. However, the biggest driver overall, rather than perhaps natural capital, as some of the headlines might have suggested, has been commercial forestry. So certainly for those 2 calendar years, commercial forestry was a bigger driver in increasing land prices and driving many of those sales. When it comes to peatlands, though, natural capital investment was a more important factor for those transactions. Interestingly, the rise in land values is very much demand-led. The supply coming to market has been broadly consistent with a 10-year average, despite the travails of COVID and things that might have happened in the last couple of years. And that's very much kind of in line with what we've seen before. So very much indicating a demand-led rise in land values, and particularly as a lot of people come in from elsewhere, a lot of different participants in the market. That's also reflected in an increasing number of off-market transactions. So rather than things being openly advertised, a lot of private sales going on. And also there's an interesting theme developing around the basis for valuing land. So perhaps traditionally land was valued very much from an agricultural or sporting perspective. That's increasingly changing to forestry, but also natural capital, biodiversity, and potential other types of values that might be coming down the line. So we'll now turn to take a look at various different types of land in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So within the agricultural land market, prime arable, of which there's a limited amount in Scotland, but that land market was operating largely as expected. Activity very much around consolidating farms in lowland areas and safeguarding businesses into the future. In upland areas, particularly for marginal grazing units, we're seeing a strong push towards converting those to forestry, particularly where some of those holdings are split up, as in the buildings and perhaps steadings being sold to lifestyle buyers, so particularly as a result of COVID, people perhaps moving out to the country, while the land is taken for forestry. Again, excuse me, with pasture and poor arable land being increasingly targeted for forestry, there is a bit of a regional variation there, with perhaps more of that happening in areas where the forestry sector is more developed, such as the south of Scotland. And we're not seeing perhaps quite as much, or certainly in those 2 years, not quite as much activity in perhaps the north of Scotland or the Highlands towards forestry at that stage. And as I say, an increasing interest from lifestyle buyers, particularly for smaller units, and perhaps some of those farmhouses and steadings that are being split from the upland holdings. Next slide, please. So forestry land continues to be the larger driver of values within Scotland. The increasingly high demand is very much mismatched with continued low supply, and this includes both established plantations as well as plantable land. And there are several factors that are promoting this price. So high timber prices, certainly over the last couple of years, although that's perhaps died back recently, was a big driver. Obviously, there are government planting targets and supportive policy, both in terms of subsidy and the tax regimes. And of course, there's been a significant interest in carbon as well. So there is a question as to whether trees are planted for commercial timber or whether they're planted for carbon. It doesn't change the fact that the trees are planted. Slightly different though when we move over to the estate sector. So next slide, please. Which has seen a significant rise in values, but again, that's largely demand driven as the supply remains low, but consistent with previous years. We've seen a significant uptick in those sales or transfers taking place privately. now well over 50%, and significantly a shift in buyers as well. So more towards corporate and institutional buyers, and again, increasing interest from overseas international buyers. And those are motivations as well, again, drifting away from perhaps more traditional sporting buyers to those looking to environmental concerns such as carbon, biodiversity, or even rewilding. So again, a mixed picture and characterized by a significant change in particularly buyer profiles and the amount of money that those buyers are bringing into the land market, certainly for those 2 years. Next slide, please. So essentially, there are a couple of kind of key conclusions to draw from the work that we've done. The rural land market, and this is a rural land market rather than urban land, but it is characterized by continued low supply and high demand, which is consistent with the 10-year average. Demand is very much the driving factor behind those increases in value. But particularly it's the change in buyer profiles and motivations that are driving that demand that are really interesting. There are a lot of new buyers coming into the market, as I've mentioned, and looking to acquire land in Scotland for a range of different factors, many of them quite new, quite novel, and very different from traditional participants within the land market. However, a lot of this had led to difficulty in participating in the land market, particularly for farmers, communities, and those who don't necessarily have the financial firepower. Obviously, high values of lands limit the ability to bid. And again, off-market transactions as well also curtail the ability for those to participate, to make offers or to negotiate to expand their own neighbouring land holdings as well. So based on that, we have a number of recommendations. So essentially around some of the structural issues, we have previously made recommendations on the land market, and those are carried through into the land reform bill that's being developed at the moment. Added to that, I think, and particularly due to the change in private and off-market transactions, we're recommending that there would be a duty of notification. So nothing particularly complicated or complex, but just an opportunity for communities, farmers, local business, individuals to at least put their hand up and be able to have a conversation about participating when land holdings come up for sale. We've also made a commitment ourselves to look at regular reporting. So this exercise that we conducted for the previous 2 calendar years, 2020 and 2021, I think it's something that builds a beginning of a trend, but it's something that will continue as well over the coming years. And hopefully we'll start to see kind of patterns emerge and be able to develop policy off the back of that. There's also indication excuse me, that we need to look perhaps more at market regulations, particularly when it comes to carbon. There is perhaps a lot of uncertainty around how that's developing at the moment, and particularly how that looks in the long term, with commitments to some interventions obviously requiring decades or even up to a century. So how that develops, particularly over the next couple of years, will set a direction for land markets and have, so we'll set a direction for the land market for coming years and potentially longer. And some of the other things that we're also looking at, so around looking at new kind of models of investment, but also better land use planning, better targeting of public finance and support to make sure that we're kind of really getting the most out of it. And I think finally, consideration of the role of tax. So part of the mix, particularly in the forestry sector, that's driving a lot of what we've seen over the last couple of years, has been that combination of public support in terms of subsidy, but also tax reliefs that are available for many circumstances. And considering whether, with a booming forestry market and other things that are going on, how necessary perhaps some of those are, or whether they could be better balanced towards other land uses. So again, some more thinking to do around those things, but it's also interesting to hear what you might have to say, or what questions you have on particularly those areas today. But that's it from me for just now, so I will hand over to Emma.
Thanks, James. That was really helpful. And it sounds like you're suffering from the same cold that I've also been suffering from recently, so well done. So I'm going to talk to you about what impact those things that James has talked about have had. So the impact of changes to land values, the impact of changing owners, and the impact of land use changes have on our communities, our businesses, other organisations, and what we need to maybe think about when we're considering that. A couple of caveats first. This is, unlike James's report, not based on systematic independent research. This is really the emerging impacts that we're finding. And that's mostly coming through from conversations with landowners, from investors, from our partners, stakeholder organisations, from communities themselves, all of those people who are being impacted. We're helping them to work their way through some of these tricky questions and starting to develop a good picture of what's actually happening, some of the risks, but also some of the things that we can see on a regular basis as well. Okay, so the use, ownership and value of land are all really interconnected. So when we're thinking about land use, that has an impact on who is interested in owning it. Who is interested in owning land has an impact on how it is valued, and the value of land has an impact on the kinds of things it might be used for. And that circle goes both ways. Everything is really interconnected between these three things. So I've started to categorize our thinking on this under those three headings. Now, particularly around land use change, we're seeing, as James has started to talk about, we're seeing land increasingly being used for natural resource management. So for trees, for rewilding, peatland restoration, maybe water management, and it's maybe being used in that way, managed in that way, owned in that way, either as an investment. It might be ethically driven, so an environmental NGO or private owners as well, perhaps are really motivated by wanting to see environmental improvements. Land might be owned by corporations or investors for offsetting or insetting purposes. And these things are really quite driven by the collective kind of purpose and the real sense behind why somebody's owning that land in the first place. So thinking about land use and thinking about what we're hearing, firstly, quite a bit of concern about what's happening out there. So these are some of the headlines. There were just over a couple of weeks, and I just pulled them out from our reporting on that. As you can see, there's concern about green leads. We hear that term being used quite often. Concern about land prices increasing, concern that rural communities might be excluded from the changes that are happening, concerns about access to land and the price of land, and concerns about tenants being evicted as well, and how that impacts on things in those communities. On the other side of it, we're also seeing that headlines around nature come back. That's pine martens, healthy urban green spaces. We're seeing organisations capturing millions of tonnes of carbon, support for woodlands in the Highlands. We're seeing farmers' profits being boosted by ecological practices. Lots of positive things happening about the way in which land is being used in a different way too. And of course, we absolutely need these things. So it's about finding a balance, and it's about seeing the positives and the risks and trying to manage those effectively, collectively. So understanding these changes really means that we are thinking about all of those aspects of it, the ownership, the value, the use of land, to make sure that that picture comes together well and we understand how to do it all well. So looking at use, first of all, and again, it would be really helpful to hear from you. I can't look in the chat while I'm talking. I'm just not that multi-skilled. But if you can put your comments in the Q&A, if you want them to be anonymous, you can choose that, or questions in the Q&A, and likewise in the chat. It's really helpful to hear from yourselves about your experiences, because we're really just building this picture up at the moment. Okay, so but thinking about use, what's actually happening? Well, in some places, we're seeing really helpful projects, bringing together different landowners, creating really coherent landscapes, thinking about all of the different aspects of need and use of land that we have, and bringing that together in a way which is really making sense. So we're getting people coming in to owning land who have really clear visions and are really aware of all those things. On the other side of that, sometimes we're seeing people coming in who maybe don't have that big picture understanding in the same way. So we're seeing areas of land where it's maybe not being managed in the coherent way across a landscape that we want to see it. So maybe where landowners aren't collaborating in the same kind of way with each other, or people in neighbouring land holdings have very different purposes for owning that land, and those purposes don't work very well together as a whole. Also with land use change, we're seeing some really long-term commitments coming into play. So where land is being used for carbon sequestration purposes, perhaps, but maybe that's peatland restoration or woodland planting, the commitment to managing that land in that way is actually a really long-term commitment, maybe 3 or 4 generations. And of course, that brings concerns with it for communities as well. Some opportunities in there, but thinking about how are we actually making sure that we engage with communities over those decisions, how we're making sure that we bring people along on that journey with us. We're also seeing land use change impacting on jobs and tenancies. Now, in some places, we've seen tenants being removed off the land and their land being managed in a different way for a different purpose. We've seen some job losses in some different communities as well. In other places, we're seeing new kinds of jobs emerging and new kinds of tenancies emerging. And there's definitely opportunities there for us to be thinking about how we best utilize those opportunities and ensure that we keep jobs in local communities, that we ensure that we've got good quality tenancies happening that are, again, helping us to manage that land in all the different ways that we want to see it being managed. The engagement element of this with communities is really complex. So we need to, in some places, we're not seeing perhaps enough of that happening, or perhaps it's not happening early enough over the land use changes which are taking place. In other places, we're seeing that there's lots of engagement happening, but it's perhaps not of the quality that it needs to be. So there was a report published recently, and I think Morag is in the session and she can hopefully post a link to that in the chat. And that really explores, in terms of forestry engagement and consultation, that statutory engagement, how communities are feeling and responding to that. But in the bigger picture, again, concerns from communities who don't feel that they're being engaged in those land use decision-making processes, or they're not being effectively engaged, or perhaps engaged early enough. In terms of land use change, that's also having impacts on how people can access the land, how they use it for recreation, on their cultural sense of place. It's having an impact on all of those things. If we think about where communities are surrounded by land use change, it's very significant for them, and it's impacting on their sense of place, on how they use that land around them. Land use change is also having an impact on local development and aspirations. And again, some positives and some negatives coming through on this. So where we've got landowners and communities working positively and collaboratively together, then the land use changes that we're seeing can actually really support local development and aspirations. Land use change can bring about new housing, new business opportunities, a whole variety of things that the community are perhaps looking for. On the other hand, of course, we can also see that being negatively impacted in some places where perhaps landowners aren't working so well with communities, or communities perhaps are finding it really difficult to engage and work together with people. James also talked about the types of owners changing at the moment. Now, where there is a change in ownership, there are always going to be some challenges for communities. So firstly, that owner, the existing owner, likely has trusted relationships with employees, with tenants, with the communities, with businesses. And of course, it takes time for a new landowner to build that up. It also brings a time of uncertainty for communities, tenants as well, businesses and so on, just not being sure necessarily what the new owner is looking for. And we hear about that quite often. We also have people coming into the market, purchasing land who perhaps have not owned land before, or they've not owned land in Scotland before. So some new landowners coming in, involved to varying degrees in the actual management of the land, but it's really important that we ensure that people are aware of the ways in which land in Scotland needs to be managed, the cultural importance of it, and so on. We're hearing in some places about potentially an increase in absentee landowners as well. So again, maybe where we've got corporates or investors purchasing land, or people from overseas purchasing land, they're not actually present in the community, they're not part of it. And of course, that has an impact on how well they understand the local community, their local knowledge, how easy it is for them to engage with people in the community as well. So that decision-making element, when an owner changes, how does the decision-making structure change? Again, we're seeing some really good models here where communities are being brought into that decision-making process in a really effective way. We're seeing different governance structures and different models and approaches to that emerging at the moment, which is really exciting. We'll be doing more on that next year. And also seeing some places where that's perhaps not happening so well, and communities are feeling, again, just not engaged and excluded from that decision-making. Really important that there's a point of contact when it comes to ownership of land in general, but certainly where there is being a change in ownership, it's really important for people to know very early on who it is they can contact with questions and concerns about that. Lastly, I'll talk briefly about the impacts of the change in valuation of land. So we hear concerns about the distribution of wealth from this. So where we're using our natural resources to generate income for people, as well as hopefully bring environmental and biodiversity benefits and all that good stuff, how is that being fairly distributed? Is it being fairly distributed? We're seeing some good examples of this starting to come through. So some organisations who have set up maybe community benefit funds, or they're working very specifically to ensure that some of the income that they're able to generate from managing the land is redistributed in a different way, and again, bringing different kinds of benefits to the community. The valuation of land, as James touched on in particular, also makes access to land potentially much more difficult for people. Now, thinking about communities and businesses and how they can access land is super important for our economy, our well-being, and so on. And community ownership, of course, is part of that, but with specific government targets attached to it as well. So both of those things combined, again, it can be done really well. So where we're seeing collaboration, partnerships, different kinds of governance models perhaps starting to emerge, we're able to see really positive impacts there happening there, but again, concerns from others about that perhaps not happening and excluding people. The final point was about sales. So we are hearing that people are perhaps being approached to sell their land where maybe they hadn't previously considered that, with very high prices sometimes being offered for that as well. As James mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment in the market, but it's certainly having an impact around the way that land is changing hands and who's purchasing it, and how that then impacts on use and ownership and everything else that we talked about. So what can we do about that? So these are some of the things that we've started to talk about and think about, and other organisations are doing the same. Again, really helpful if people can post in the chat or anonymously in the Q&A if they want to, any thoughts they have on this. We're still learning and working this out for ourselves too. So firstly, supporting and advising new landowners. This is a really critical part of the work that we're doing at the Commission at the moment. We have a protocol on natural capital and carbon management that really helps people to understand what the key expectations are from landowners, the ways in which they can make sure that we're making the most of all these positives, of all these opportunities that these changes bring, but also ensuring that they are managing the potential risks and the negative impacts from these things. So using those tools available, and there are other tools from other organisations as well around starting to come out around how do you measure the impact of what you're doing, how do you consider the full biodiversity of the land that you're managing, and so on. So staying connected and learning those things is really helpful. Engagement and collaboration, this is always crucial. You know, I'm always talking about this. Communication is so vital, but giving communities and landowners and other partners, businesses, individuals, public bodies, chances to think about how they could work together to achieve the very best from that area of land is really important. And again, we have some tools available on our website to help people take that forward in the right kind of way. As part of that, we need to think about how we're sharing the benefits. So is that through things like community benefit funds, or is it taking more of a community wealth building approach, procuring services locally, ensuring that there are apprenticeship opportunities, training opportunities within an area? Sharing those benefits is really important, and doing that in a deliberate way and a considered way is also really important. We're starting to look at what community benefit might look like with a number of partners, but Highlands Islands Enterprise in particular, to think about what those kind of models could be, and we'll be sharing more about that just quite early on in the new year, actually. As part of that, we could be thinking also about shared governance models. So does land need to be owned or managed by new people, or are there different ways of collaborating, different ways of creating decision-making structures that bring a balance to the power there, bring a balance to decision-making, help good decisions to be made that benefit people more widely? And within all of this, of course, is the government's objective around attracting the right kind of investment. So bringing the right kind of organisations into Scotland to make this investment in our natural capital that we need, but doing that in the right kind of way. So there are currently the interim principles for responsible investment in natural capital that the Scottish Government published. We helped them to put those together. And they start to outline the things that they feel investors should be considering, corporates should be considering if they're thinking of purchasing and managing land in Scotland. Okay, that's it from me just for now, and I will pass back to James, who is hopefully been having a bit of a look through the questions and starting to think about anything in the chat that we want to respond to, or anything from the Q&A that it might be helpful for other people to be thinking about and hearing about as well.
Yes, I think I'll come straight back to you, Emma, with one of the questions that I've spotted in the chat, which is, are there, or what patterns are emerging, if any, in relation to collaborative investment structures at the moment?
Yeah, great question. I'm not sure about patterns, but we're definitely starting to see examples of organisations who want to approach this in a different way. So a few months ago, I think it was now, we hosted a webinar. The University of Edinburgh came to talk about wanting to partner with communities to, which would essentially be around paying them a regular income, securing a regular income for the community, whilst they were using the carbon sequestered on the land, managing the land using the carbon sequestered to offset their unavoidable emissions, for example. We're also talking to other investors who are maybe helping to aggregate projects, so bring together enough land, enough carbon sequestration together for it to be an investable proposition, and thinking about what's the payoff, what's the return for communities as part of that. Yeah. Is there anything that you've spotted or heard on that one, James, as well?
Yeah, so I'll give you a chance to have a look through the chat and the questions yourself, but one that I've spotted around, is there sufficient work going into valuing landscape, the intersection between geology, nature, people, culture, within the valuation models for natural capital? And this is something that came up in our research, is that there is a lot of uncertainty within current valuation methodology, and the traditional way of looking at land and particularly estates in terms of what they deliver is very much changing, but we haven't quite got to any kind of agreed framework. There's a lot of kind of speculation, a lot of finger in the air, to be honest, about what we're doing and or what the sector is doing in terms of determining values. But it's an area for us within the Commission that we'll be looking at in more detail over the coming years. But yeah, there's a lot more going on in terms of how we value land than there has been traditionally. There are a lot of, I think, as the question notes, there are a lot of intersections between different things that simply haven't been considered in the past that we really do need to start taking account of. So the short answer is there sufficient work? Possibly. We're certainly going to start picking up doing more of it. But I don't know that we're anywhere near any sorts of conclusions at this stage yet.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I would agree. It's a really complex picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we're certainly encouraging people to be thinking about the different kinds of impacts they have on the land and the different ways in which those can be valued in their decision-making processes. Yeah, and definitely more to be done on that aspect of things, I think. I picked up a question from Claire in the Q&A box, which is about local place plans, and if they have a role in how communities can have more of a say in land use change. And if so, how could communities be encouraged to develop local place plans that voice their interests and concerns? So from my perspective, yes, I think local place plans have a really important role in helping communities to understand what their priorities are, what their aspirations are, what are the challenges that they are facing as a community, how can they think about addressing those, and how can the stakeholders in their area, how can all the people within that place be involved in that, and what are their roles in it? And so land use change is for me absolutely part of that. So it could be around communities wanting to have more allotments, recreation spaces. It could be around housing or small business units. And I think it's really helpful if, firstly, landowners are thinking about how they can refer to local place plans where they exist, or other local resources, to understand what those things are, and using them also to find a way into talking to the right kinds of people in their communities about how to make those things happen, how to collaborate basically on that. James, it says magically on here that you would like to answer this question. I did not know you could do that, so apologies, and over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm happy to, I would endorse everything you've just said. I think one of the themes that did come through in the work that we did previously was around better land use planning, and I think local place plans are very much a route into that. There are clear links, I think, with the ongoing regional land use partnerships pilots at the moment, And I think if people are involved or in areas where those exist, then I would encourage you to get involved if you can with their development, because I think that's probably the type of forum, along with the development of local place plans, where people really could make their voices heard. And particularly when it comes to some of the issues around kind of the big land use change, we really are looking at things that are better happening at landscape scale rather than on perhaps a patchwork of independent holdings, or neighbouring landowners taking very different approaches is not necessarily the kind of the answers that we need in the times that we're in. So I think the more we can do to improve land use planning, both at kind of a regional scale, but also at a local scale, and particularly make sure we're including those local voices, has to be welcomed.
Great, thanks, James. We've got loads of comments and questions, but I'll just pass this one straight to you if that's okay. It's about, is the Scottish Land Commission liaising with government on the new agricultural bill and helping to ensure that there's joined up thinking on the issues that would impact, for example, new farmers. And perhaps you could just explain, for those who might not be so clear on this, why we would be doing that. What would be the importance of making sure that that's joined up?
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of the easy answer to that is yes, we are involved, particularly through the Office of the Tenant Farming Commissioner, and the Tenant Farming Commissioner also convenes TFAF, which is a Tenant Farming Advisory Forum, which also brings together kind of various sectoral stakeholders, so the NFU, SLE, and various others as well, to discuss some of these big issues, generally in terms of a kind of tenanted or agricultural holdings context, but obviously farmers across the country, whether they're tenants or owner occupiers, face very many of the same issues that will be kind of developing and that will operate under the same frameworks in the agricultural bill. But yes, ensuring that these types of things are joined up, and it ties into the kind of the answer that I was giving before. It is about joining up different types of land uses. So it's not just about, kind of natural capital, carbon sequestration, tackling, kind of climate change and biodiversity loss, but food security has understandably shot right up the agenda this year. There are big questions around the impacts of land use change on the ability of, kind of Scottish farmers to continue to be able to feed the country, and those types of questions are, kind of incredibly important. So it is about getting a balance, and I think our role in speaking to government is to make sure that we're not getting involved in necessarily individual kind of decisions about particular pieces of land, but ensuring that the framework that everything operates within is balanced and fair and reasonable and meets the needs of all of Scotland's land users and the nation collectively, so that we are able to meet the challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, but also feed ourselves, provide materials that we need for construction or whatever else it might be, and support rural communities. So yeah, we'll hopefully keep doing that, and hopefully government will listen.
Yeah. Thanks, James. That's great. I'll pick up a couple of quick ones and then ask maybe if you could just finish off by answering the question from Jean that's in the Q&A. Yeah, great. So somebody has asked about what digital tech platforms would you use for engagements? Now, we don't have anything that we specifically recommend here, because I think it's really important to think about the ways in which communities are already being engaged with and interacting with online platforms. So thinking about social media, thinking about community newsletters, thinking about printing these things too. So thinking quite broadly about trying to use a range of different ways in which you can reach communities. I'm not going to explain carbon credits and offsetting now, I'm really sorry, but I'll try and signpost to a good source of information on that, just to set it out. There are some good sources of information on it that I can share. And finally, yes, about the collaborative investment models, we will have the case studies out in the new year. So do keep an eye on our social media and our website to pick up on those things. Okay, James, over to you, and then we'll need to wrap up.
Cool. Do you want to ask the question?
Sure.
It's quite a long one. So.
It is. So how do we make sure, James, that land, which of course is sort of so important to everybody, and our natural capital, so natural capital being all of the natural resources that we have, trees and water and air and all of those things, how do we make sure that those things aren't at the vagaries of economic markets and economic profit motives. So how can we make sure that they're being looked after in a way that considers that they're important to everybody and not driven by a more of a capitalist approach? I hope that's okay, Jean, sorry.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. Where we are, I think, just as a bit of background at the moment, is that the Scottish Government has kind of recognised that there is a £20 billion funding gap over the next decade that's required to invest in Scotland's natural capital right across the board. And that's money that has to be raised from the private sector somehow or some way. So with that as the context, I think what we need to be able to do is ensure that the framework around how that investment is made, how that investment is attracted to Scotland in the first place, is something that's balanced and fair and proportionate, and I think meets the needs of not just the investors in terms of a return, but also actually delivers the other things that the investment is designed to deliver. So particularly if we're looking at carbon or biodiversity, those are the obvious things. But within that framework, I think there is a broader point to be made around things like community engagement, wider benefits. So whether that's take a renewables example of community benefit funds, if and where that's appropriate, or if there are wider benefits to local communities, to local business, from kind of land use change that's going to take place. So I think private investment in the way that it can be managed, the way it can be framed, could be incredibly important and is a huge opportunity for Scotland. But it is very much about getting that framework right, getting that balance between ambitions and aspirations of different parties, different land users, communities, local business, farmers, everyone sitting around the table and kind of making those decisions and ensuring that process is fair. And I think ultimately, perhaps that is the summation of what the just transition is all about. It's going to require, work from everyone, investment from all sectors, public, private, community, but it's finding the way to do that. And hopefully that's something that we can, as the Land Commission, can start to develop and advise and work with partners to develop.
That's great. Thanks, James. And we should signpost people handily at this point to our previous webinar on collaborating, reach to collaboration. So I'm sure Lisa will be able to do that for everybody as well. So that's great. Thank you. We've got just a couple of last things. So firstly, I'm going to just share with you some details of the next webinar that we have next week. And then I'm going to pass to Lisa, who is going to ask you just to share a little bit more information with us again. So this next webinar is much more detail about actually what is it that exactly specifically we're asking people to be doing when they're owning or managing land. It's called Responsible Natural Capital and Carbon Management. It is on the 14th of December. It's 12 till 12:45 again, and you can book at the Land Commission website. Lisa, can I pass over to you to do the last poll for us?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Yep, I've just been trying to keep up with the chat and posting things into it. So thanks for everyone for being really patient with me while I do that. Yeah, as I say, we've got a little second poll here, which is an evaluation for us about how the webinar has been for everyone today. I know we're near the end and we've not got a lot of time left, but please, we're so grateful for you having some input into that to help us shape future ones. So go ahead, fill that in. I think it's 4 questions again, just scroll through, and I'm going to pop some links in the chat about future sessions. I'm also going to share our contact details. I'm going to pop in there the resource page for this specific session today. I've already popped in the chat the whole collection of resource pages on our Wakelet, so have a look back through the chat if you haven't had the chance to check that out yet. So yeah, I'll be quiet. I'll put those links in the chat and let you go on with the survey.
Thanks, Lisa. So I know that you're going to pop the link to our mailing list in the chat as we go along, and I'm sure people can access that from the website as well. Just to encourage people to think about signing up if they haven't already. We don't send out too much information, but we do send out kind of our headline stuff on a regular basis. And that just helps you to pick and choose the bits of our work that you're most interested in and stay up to date with the latest research and thinking and tools and guidance and so on that as well.
thanks very much everyone for coming today. I hope you have found it really interesting. Obviously all the links are there. The recording will be up on our YouTube channel at some point in the next wee while, but yeah, please look out for the next sessions in the series and sign up, and hopefully we'll see each other or hear from you soon. So thank you and goodbye. Have a good lunch.